My name is Stella. I am 33 years old, and my husband auctioned me off for $22 in front of 400 guests. Who wants this useless wife? He shouted into the microphone, his voice echoing through the grand ballroom of the Silicon Valley charity gala. She crunches numbers in a basement all day, so I will start the bidding at $22, exactly what she makes in an hour. Everyone laughed. I just sat there in silence, my nails digging into the palms of my hands. Then a deep, commanding voice rang out from the VIP section. $5 million. My husband's smile vanished. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a partner who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up, I was taught that marriage meant partnership and sacrifice. For 5 years, I worked 3 exhausting jobs to keep a roof over our heads while Bradley built his tech startup. I paid the mortgage. I bought his tailored suits. I even paid for the servers running the code that was about to make him a billionaire. Tonight was supposed to be our victory lap. His company was preparing for a massive initial public offering next week. Instead, it became the stage for my ultimate public humiliation. The Crystal Pavilion was packed with the elite of the tech world. Investors, venture capitalists, and media personalities held their champagne flutes, watching Bradley strut across the stage. He was drunk on power and expensive scotch. He had already auctioned off a vintage sports car and a weekend in Aspen. Then his eyes locked onto me, sitting quietly at table number 4 in the self-made dress I had sewn to save money. He snapped his fingers at the spotlight operator pointing directly at me. The blinding white light hit my face. I blinked confused as Bradley chuckled into the microphone. Look at her, folks. The ultimate anchor weighing down a rocket ship. She still thinks a good night out involves balancing spreadsheets and clipping coupons. Let us put her on the auction block. $22 for the most boring accountant in California. Do I hear 23? A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd, quickly escalating into full-blown laughter as the investors decided to play along with the CEO. A man at the table next to mine raised his bidding paddle, shouting $25, adding that he needed someone to do his taxes. Another executive yelled $30, joking that my dress looked like it was made of old curtains. I did not cry. I did not run out of the room. I sat perfectly still, absorbing every insult, every laugh, every ounce of betrayal. Bradley was looking at me with pure contempt, finally showing his true colors. Now that he was on the verge of billionaire status, the woman who had carried him through his darkest, most pathetic years was nothing but a punchline. He wanted to break me so I would quietly disappear before he rang the bell at the stock exchange. Going once, Bradley mocked, slamming his hand on the podium. Going twice. $5 million. The voice sliced through the laughter like a steel blade. It did not come from the drunken executives near the front. It came from the shadows of the VIP section at the very back of the room. The entire ballroom went dead silent, heads turned, craning to see who had spoken. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped into the light. He wore a sharp charcoal suit that made Bradley's flashy tuxedo look cheap. It was Nathaniel. Everyone in Silicon Valley knew his face. He was a notorious self-made billionaire, an activist investor who had a reputation for hostile takeovers and destroying corrupt corporate boards. What nobody in that room knew was why a man of his stature was bidding on a so-called boring accountant. Bradley's smug smile faltered, replaced by a nervous, twitching grin. "Nathaniel, buddy?" He stammered into the microphone, his voice cracking slightly. "We are just having a little fun here. The wife is not actually for sale. We are just raising money for the charity." Nathaniel did not smile. He did not laugh. He walked slowly down the center aisle, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. His gaze was locked entirely on Bradley, his expression completely unreadable. The heavy silence in the room was suffocating. The only sound was the steady click of Nathaniel's leather shoes against the polished marble floor. When he reached the front of the room, Nathaniel walked straight up the steps to the stage. He stood inches away from Bradley, towering over him, radiating an intimidating, quiet authority. He reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded document. "I am not joking, Bradley," Nathaniel said, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom without needing a microphone. He slammed a certified cashier's check onto the acrylic podium. The loud smack made Bradley jump. "That is a certified check for exactly $5 million, Nathaniel stated coldly, his eyes piercing through my husband's crumbling bravado. "The transaction is cleared. The bid is binding. She leaves with me right now." My heart pounded against my ribs, but my face remained a calm, unreadable mask. The investors sitting around me were frozen, their mouths slightly open, realizing they had just participated in a catastrophic mistake. Bradley stared at the check, the zeros reflecting in his widened eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, to assert his dominance, but no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of Nathaniel's presence. I slowly stood up from table number 4. I smoothed out the wrinkles in my cheap dress, grabbed my handbag, and looked directly at the man I had married. This was not an ending. It was the beginning of his absolute destruction. I walked forward toward the brightly lit stage. The heavy silence in the ballroom shattered into a chaotic roar of whispers as my heels clicked against the polished marble floor. Bradley leaned forward over the podium, his face flushed an ugly shade of crimson. He extended his hand with that practiced, camera-ready smile he used to manipulate investors. He expected me to take it. He truly expected me to play the dutiful, embarrassed wife, to laugh off the ultimate humiliation, and to walk quietly back to our table so he could salvage his keynote speech. Instead, I glided right past his outstretched hand. I did not even blink in his direction. I stopped directly in front of Nathaniel. Up close, the billionaire was even more imposing. His sharp gaze assessed me not as a prize to be won, but as a calculated investment. He offered his arm. I took it, and together we turned our backs on my husband and his 400 elite guests. "Stella, get back here right now!" Bradley hissed into the microphone, the audio feedback whining sharply through the expensive speakers. His fake, charming executive persona was slipping rapidly, revealing the arrogant, desperate bully I had endured for the last 5 years. I did not stop walking. Nathaniel and I moved through the grand double doors of the Crystal Pavilion and stepped out into the crisp Silicon Valley night. The valet area was bathed in the harsh, artificial glow of street lamps. Before Nathaniel's driver could even pull the car around, the heavy pavilion doors burst open behind us. Bradley stormed out into the cold air, his silk bow tie undone, his face twisted in pure, unadulterated rage. He closed the distance between us in seconds, lunging forward and grabbing my upper arm with a bruising, aggressive grip. He yanked me backward, completely ignoring the billionaire standing right next to me. "You think this is funny?" He spat his breath, reeking of expensive bourbon and panic. "You are my wife. You do not get to humiliate me in front of my board of directors. Get in the car, Stella. We are going home, and you are going to explain why you are suddenly acting like a cheap gold digger, jumping at the very first fat wallet you see." The sheer hypocrisy of his words was stunning. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, then up at his furious face. "A gold digger." I repeated, my voice deadly calm and perfectly steady. "I paid the rent on our studio apartment for 3 years, while you maxed out my personal credit cards to buy servers. I funded the prototype of your software with my overtime pay. You just auctioned me off like livestock because you think my usefulness expired the exact moment you secured venture capital." "Let go of my arm, Bradley." "I said get in the car," he snarled, tightening his grip and trying to physically drag me toward his parked vehicle. He never made it a second step. 2 massive men in dark suits materialized from the shadows with terrifying speed. Nathaniel's private security detail moved with absolute, calculated precision. One guard clamped a heavy hand over Bradley's wrist, applying a sharp pressure point that made my husband gasp in pain and release me instantly. The second guard drove a thick forearm into Bradley's chest, shoving him backward with incredible force until his spine slammed hard against a solid concrete parking pillar. Bradley gasped for air, his eyes wide with sudden, overwhelming panic, as the 2 trained men pinned him effortlessly. Nathaniel adjusted his pristine cuffs, completely unbothered by the sudden violence happening 2 feet away. He stepped closer to Bradley, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that demanded absolute obedience. The transaction was cleared, Bradley. When I buy an asset, I expect the seller to honor the terms of the deal without throwing a pathetic tantrum in the parking lot. If you ever touch her again, I will not use my security team. I will personally ruin you before your stock even hits the open market. Do we have a clear understanding? Bradley swallowed hard, trapped against the cold concrete, humiliated and terrified by a man with infinitely more power. He managed a weak, trembling nod. Nathaniel gestured to his driver, who immediately pulled a sleek, midnight black Rolls-Royce up to the curb. Nathaniel opened the passenger door himself, offering me a slight, respectful nod. I smoothed the skirt of my self-made dress and stepped into the plush leather interior. As the heavy doors closed, shutting out the noise of the valet stand and the pathetic sight of my husband slumped against the pillar, the car glided smoothly onto the highway. The cabin was utterly silent, perfectly insulated from the chaotic outside world. I sat completely straight, my hands resting neatly in my lap. I did not cry. I did not shake. The time for crying had ended years ago when I realized Bradley was systematically draining my accounts to fund his lavish lunches while I ate instant noodles at my desk. Nathaniel watched me carefully from the opposite seat. He poured a glass of sparkling water from the center console and handed it to me. Most people would be in tears right now, he observed, his tone highly analytical, or at least demanding to know where I am taking them. Tears are a terrible return on investment, I replied, accepting the glass without hesitation. And considering you just dropped $5 million on a public stunt, I highly doubt your endgame is kidnapping a woman who buys her fabric on clearance. A slow, genuine smile spread across Nathaniel's face. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a high-end tablet, unlocking the screen and sliding it across the seat toward me. Look at the numbers, Stella. I glanced down at the glowing screen. It displayed the real-time pre-IPO stock valuations of Bradley's tech company. The numbers were climbing rapidly, fueled by the aggressive marketing campaign Bradley had been pushing all month. Ignorant investors were practically throwing their money at him, completely blind to the absolute rot hiding underneath the surface. He thinks he has won, Nathaniel said, tapping the screen lightly. He thinks he is untouchable because the board loves his arrogant executive act. But I know you have seen his private books. I know you know exactly where the bodies are buried. Before I could process Nathaniel's loaded words, a harsh vibration interrupted the quiet cabin. My phone lit up inside my purse. I pulled it out. It was an urgent text message from Bradley. The words on the screen were venomous, a desperate attempt by a cornered man to regain his lost control. I just froze all our joint bank accounts, the message read. You have zero access to cash your car or the house. Come home right now and beg for my forgiveness, or I am calling Page 6. I will tell the entire country that my wife is nothing but a high-priced escort who sold herself to a billionaire. I will ruin your life. I stared at the threatening message illuminating the dark interior of the car. He actually thought freezing a joint account would leave me helpless. He thought my entire existence was tied to him. My husband had just declared war, completely unaware that he had handed me the exact weapon I needed. The sun had barely risen over the Santa Cruz Mountains when I pulled my rental car into the sprawling driveway of the estate Bradley and I called home. I had not slept a wink at the luxury hotel Nathaniel arranged for me, but my mind had never been clearer. I came back solely to pack my essential documents and a few personal items. I fully expected Bradley to be hungover or aggressively demanding apologies for the disastrous gala. I did not expect the chaotic scene unfolding on the pristine front lawn. My mother-in-law Barbara and my sister-in-law Cassidy were dragging heavy black garbage bags out the front double doors. They were violently hurling my clothes, my shoes, and my personal belongings directly onto the wet morning grass. The morning air carried a slight chill, a sharp contrast to the heated hostility radiating from the women. Barbara wore her pristine tennis club attire, her face twisted in an ugly sneer as she dumped a drawer of my perfectly folded sweaters onto the driveway. "You ungrateful little tramp!" Barbara screamed when she saw me step out of the rental car. "You bring absolute shame to this family on the most important night of my son's life. How dare you show your face here?" Cassidy strutted up behind her mother, kicking a pair of my heels into the dirt. "You are lucky we are just throwing your cheap clothes out." Stella. Cassidy spat, crossing her arms tightly over her expensive cashmere wrap. "Bradley is changing the locks right now. You thought you could run off with some billionaire and then crawl back to our house. You are nothing but a common gold digger. We are making sure everyone in our social circle knows exactly what you are." I stood at the edge of the driveway, looking at the scattered pieces of my life. I had spent years attempting to earn their respect, cooking holiday dinners and buying thoughtful gifts, but they always viewed me with thinly veiled disgust. They actually thought they held all the power. They believed the narrative Bradley had spoon-fed them for years, that he was the genius provider, and I was the lucky charity case who got to live in his towering shadow. "Stop it right now! Both of you back away from her things." The sharp, commanding voice belonged to Malik. My brother-in-law jogged down the front steps, his face tight with furious disbelief. Malik was the director of compliance at Bradley's company and the only person in this family with a functioning moral compass. He rushed over to the lawn and immediately started picking up my scattered clothes, brushing the dirt off my jackets. "What is wrong with you two?" Malik yelled, turning to glare at his wife and mother-in-law. "Stella has literally kept this family afloat for years. Have you lost your minds? She paid for your bypass surgery last year out of her own pocket, Barbara. Do not pretend you forgot that." Cassidy marched over and slapped the clothes right out of her husband's hands. "Do not, you dare defend her, Malik!" she shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red. "You are just an employee at my brother's company. You married into this family, so you need to remember your proper place and back us up. You do not get to dictate how we handle this trash." Malik stood up to his full height, staring down at his wife with a look of absolute disgust. He was a brilliant, hardworking man, and seeing Cassidy reduce him to a mere subordinate in front of me made my blood boil. I placed a gentle hand on Malik's shoulder. "Thank you, Malik," I said quietly. "But you do not need to defend me against them anymore. They are not worth your energy or your career." Before Malik could say another word, a pair of local police cruisers turned onto our private street, their lights flashing silently in the early morning light. Right behind them was Bradley driving his sleek sports car. He parked aggressively, blocking my rental car in the driveway, and practically leaped out to meet the officers. He looked smug, fully restored to his arrogant CEO persona, backed by the authority of law enforcement. "Officers, this is the woman I called you about," Bradley announced, pointing a finger directly at my chest. "She is trying to unlawfully enter my property after abandoning the marital home last night. I want her escorted off the premises immediately." The two officers approached cautiously, assessing the scattered garbage bags and the tense family dynamic. "Ma'am, is this your residence?" the taller officer asked me, resting his hands lightly on his duty belt. Bradley did not even let me answer. "She is my soon-to-be ex-wife," he interrupted, stepping uncomfortably close to me. "And before she leaves, I am demanding she hand over the funds she secured last night. She accepted a $5 million check from another man while legally married to me. Half of that money is marital property. Stella and I am not letting you leave with my share." The sheer hypocrisy of his demand was staggering, a perfect reflection of his deeply ingrained narcissism. He had publicly humiliated me, physically grabbed me, threatened to destroy my reputation with tabloid rumors, and now he was trying to use the police to extort $2.5 million out of a check he had zero claim to. Barbara and Cassidy stood proudly behind him, nodding along, as if Bradley was a victim asserting his righteous legal rights. "You are delusional, Bradley," I said, keeping my tone steady and conversational. "You auctioned me off for $22. You told the world I was useless. You do not get a cut of anything." Bradley crossed his arms, flashing a predatory grin. "I am the sole owner of this estate, Stella. I pay the mortgage. I am the breadwinner. You are trespassing. Officers, remove her." I maintained control, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I calmly set my briefcase on the hood of my rental car, unlatched the metal clasps, and pulled out a thick stack of notarized legal documents bearing the state's seal. I walked past my husband and handed the heavy packet directly to the taller police officer. Actually, officers, I would appreciate it if you could escort these 3 trespassers off my property, I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the morning air. The officer frowned, scanning the first page. Bradley scoffed loudly. What garbage did you print out, Stella? You cannot fake a property deed. I turned to look Bradley dead in the eyes. I did not fake anything. You defaulted on the second mortgage 2 years ago when you drained the accounts to buy sports cars and fund your corporate parties. The bank was going to foreclose on you. I used the money from my private LLC to quietly buy out your defaulted debt. I own the mortgage, I own the land, I own this house. The color rapidly drained from Bradley's face as the police officer flipped to the second page, verifying the official state stamps and signatures. Ma'am, this deed is valid, the officer stated, looking up at Bradley. Sir, she is the legal owner of this property. Barbara let out a sharp gasp, clutching her chest. Cassidy stared at me with her mouth hanging wide open. Bradley stumbled back a step, looking at the sprawling mansion he had used as a status symbol for years, suddenly realizing it had never truly been his. I checked my wristwatch, looking back up at the man who had tried to destroy me. You, your mother, and your sister have exactly 60 minutes to pack whatever fits into your car and vacate my property, I commanded. Or I will have you all arrested for trespassing. The taller police officer tapped the thick stack of legal documents against his palm and turned his stern gaze back to my husband. Sir, he said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. You heard the property owner. You have 1 hour to gather your personal effects and vacate the premises. If you refuse or cause any further disturbance, you will be placed under arrest for trespassing. Bradley stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant tech chief executive officer, who had just strutted across a gala stage mere hours ago, was now visibly trembling on the damp morning grass. Barbara let out a piercing wail, dropping to her knees right next to the pile of my discarded sweaters she had so gleefully tossed outside. She began hyperventilating, crying out that this was her son's house, that they were a respectable family, and that the police were making a terrible mistake. Cassidy immediately rushed to comfort her mother, shooting venomous glares in my direction, while simultaneously realizing she had nowhere to live. You cannot do this to us, Bradley choked out, his voice cracking as the humiliating reality set in. My company goes public next week. The optics of this will ruin me. I stepped closer to him, keeping my voice perfectly level. You should have considered the optics before you treated your wife like a discount clearance item in front of your board of directors, I replied. Now start packing. For the next 60 minutes, I stood on the porch with my arms crossed, flanked by the 2 police officers, and watched pure poetic justice unfold. Bradley, Barbara, and Cassidy were forced to frantically stuff their designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and whatever valuables they could grab into the very same black garbage bags they had originally intended for me. The sheer indignity of hauling trash bags to Bradley's sports car under the watchful eyes of law enforcement was a punishment far sweeter than anything I could have ever screamed at them. Malik did not help them pack. He quietly gathered his own briefcase from the entryway, avoiding the hysterical sobbing of his wife and mother-in-law. As he walked past me down the driveway, he paused. He looked at the police, looked at the garbage bags, and then looked right into my eyes. He gave me a single, distinct nod of profound respect. He understood exactly what I had done and why I had done it. Then he got into his own car and drove away, leaving the toxic family to fend for themselves. Exactly 1 hour later, Bradley's overloaded sports car peeled out of my driveway. I locked the front doors of my mansion, finally breathing in the silence. But I knew the war was far from over. Bradley was a cornered narcissist with a massive platform, and his retaliation was going to be swift and vicious. By noon, my phone was exploding with news alerts. Enraged and homeless, Bradley had immediately weaponized his startup's ruthless public relations machine. He called in favors with local tech journalists and deployed a coordinated smear campaign across every major social media platform. The narrative he fabricated was aggressively misogynistic but incredibly effective. He painted himself as the betrayed founder who worked tirelessly to build an empire, only to be blindsided by a manipulative wife. His press release claimed I was a common gold digger who seduced a billionaire just weeks before the initial public offering to steal his home and extort him for his cash. The media eagerly devoured the scandalous story. Articles labeled me a high-priced escort and a corporate parasite. Paparazzi quickly discovered my location and descended upon my neighborhood, swarming the gates of my estate. They camped out with long-lens cameras, shouting aggressive questions about my supposed affair with Nathaniel every time I walked near a window. They expected me to cower in shame, to hide my face behind dark sunglasses, and to issue a tearful, desperate apology to salvage my reputation. They heavily underestimated who they were dealing with today. I ignored the ringing phones and the flashing cameras outside. Instead of hiding, I put on a razor-sharp tailored midnight blue suit that commanded absolute authority. I confidently drove my car straight through the crowd of shouting reporters, completely ignoring their flashing bulbs, and headed directly into the heart of downtown San Francisco. I parked in the secure underground garage of a towering, unmarked high-rise building located in the financial district. There was no flashy corporate logo on the exterior, no welcoming lobby for the general public, and absolutely no press allowed inside. I swiped a highly encrypted security badge at the private elevator, bypassed the standard floors, and rode all the way up to the restricted executive level. The steel doors slid open to reveal a sprawling high-tech command center buzzing with intense focused activity. Analysts in sharp suits were rapidly typing across arrays of dual monitors, tracing offshore accounts, running complex algorithms, and dissecting encrypted corporate ledgers. This was not a quiet, boring accounting firm. This was the headquarters of the most ruthless forensic auditing agency on the West Coast, a private firm contracting with federal agencies to dismantle white-collar crime syndicates. I was not a low-level number cruncher doing taxes in a basement, as my husband had so proudly proclaimed to his elite investors. I was the managing director here. For years, I had deliberately played the role of the quiet, unremarkable wife to keep Bradley's fragile ego intact, while I quietly built an investigative empire in the shadows. I strode past the rows of analysts, my heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor, and pushed open the frosted glass doors to the main conference room. My elite strike team was already assembled around the massive mahogany table, their laptops open and ready for war. "Let us get to work," I commanded, taking my seat at the head of the long table. The heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room swung open before my team could even open their initial files. Nathaniel strode in, bringing the same undeniable authority he had displayed in the ballroom the night before. He took the empty seat to my right, unbuttoning his suit jacket with fluid efficiency. My senior analysts stared at him in stunned silence. They were accustomed to high-profile clients, but seeing a billionaire of his magnitude walk casually into our secure facility was entirely different. I did not offer any dramatic introductions. I simply pushed a digital contract across the mahogany table toward him. "You certainly know how to make a public statement, Nathaniel," I said, looking at the glowing screen showing his signature. "But my firm requires standard onboarding procedures even for hostile takeover specialists." Nathaniel chuckled, a low sound that broke the tension in the room. He tapped his pen against the table. "I assume your team understands that the $5 million I dropped last night was not a romantic gesture," he said, addressing the room. "I do not buy wives. I buy expertise." That cashier check was an expedited, non-refundable retainer fee to hire the best forensic auditing firm in California. I needed to extract your boss from that ridiculous gala immediately so we could get to work. The analysts nodded, their professional focus instantly returning. I brought up the primary holographic display at the front of the room, casting a blinding web of financial data onto the wall. "Why my husband?" I asked, turning to Nathaniel. "You have your pick of 1,000 tech startups preparing to go public this quarter. Why target his specific company for a hostile takeover?" Nathaniel leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he studied the projected numbers. "Because his pre-initial public offering valuation makes absolutely no mathematical sense," he explained. "His board of directors is celebrating a billion-dollar valuation based on user acquisition metrics that look entirely fabricated. I want to buy his company and strip it for its proprietary algorithm, but I suspect the books are completely cooked." I need you to find the rotting core of his empire before I launch my bid. If he is hiding massive liabilities, I want to use that leverage to force a fire sale and push him out entirely. You came to the right place, I replied, my fingers flying across my keyboard. Let us tear him apart. For the next 14 hours, my team and I dissected every single financial disclosure Bradley had filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission over the past 3 years. The conference room transformed into a war zone of scattered papers, empty coffee cups, and rapidly shifting data models. We bypassed the polished marketing brochures and dug straight into the raw, unedited tax filings. Bradley had always thought I was just a boring number cruncher. He never realized that my ability to see the hidden stories inside numerical data was exactly what made me lethal. By 3 a.m, the complex web of my husband's deceit finally began to unravel on our monitors. I isolated a series of recurring, highly suspicious wire transfers. Look at this routing pattern, I instructed, pointing a laser pointer at the primary screen. Bradley is not just inflating his user metrics. He is actively embezzling investor capital. Nathaniel stood up, walking closer to the screen. Explain the mechanism, he demanded, his voice tight with predatory focus. He is using dummy vendor invoices, I said, pulling up a secondary spreadsheet. Every quarter, right after a major funding round, his startup pays massive consulting fees to 3 specific overseas entities. On paper, they look like international software development contractors. But when you cross-reference their tax identification numbers, they trace back to a single registered agent in the Cayman Islands. He is funneling millions of dollars out of his own company and laundering it through these offshore shell corporations. My lead data analyst typed furiously, running the offshore account numbers through our proprietary tracking software. Stella is right, the analyst confirmed loudly. The money does not stay in the Caymans. It gets routed right back into the United States through anonymous real estate trusts and luxury vehicle holding companies. That is how he afforded the sudden lifestyle upgrade without triggering an internal audit. He is stealing directly from the venture capitalists backing his public offering. The sheer scale of the fraud was breathtaking. Bradley was standing on a house of cards ready to defraud the entire public market. If we handed this preliminary data over to federal regulators right now, the initial public offering would be halted immediately. But preliminary data was not enough for a federal indictment. We needed the absolute, undeniable proof of the original wire authorizations. We needed to show Bradley's digital fingerprints on the actual transfers. I initiated a deep dive scan into the company's external firewall, searching for a backdoor into their financial server. A harsh red error message flashed across all our screens. Access denied. We have a major problem, I announced, rubbing my temples in frustration. Bradley is arrogant, but his network security architect is top tier. The raw, unencrypted server logs containing the original wire transfer authorizations are locked behind an air-gapped local server. It is physically disconnected from the cloud. Can your team hack it remotely? Nathaniel asked, pacing the length of the conference room. No, I replied firmly. Any unauthorized attempt to breach that specific server will instantly trigger a system-wide lockdown. Bradley would be alerted, and he would permanently wipe the drives before we could secure a warrant. There is only one way to get that data. We need someone on the inside. Who has the clearance? Nathaniel pressed. I pulled up the corporate hierarchy chart on the main screen, my eyes locking onto a familiar face. To pull the logs without triggering the alarm, we need the security credentials of an executive who handles internal investigations. We need the director of compliance. I stared at the photograph of Malik illuminating the dark conference room. My brother-in-law was a brilliant man, a fiercely dedicated compliance officer who had worked tirelessly to earn his place. I also knew he was currently walking into a deadly trap. While my team mapped out the extraction strategy, a much darker scheme was actively unfolding inside my husband's temporary corporate penthouse. Bradley was pacing the length of his lavish office, his leather shoes sinking into the thick carpet. The arrogant facade he had paraded at the gala was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, suffocating panic. The Securities and Exchange Commission had just delivered a formal notice of inquiry. It was supposed to be a routine pre-initial public offering audit. But for a man hiding $50 million stolen dollars, it was a death sentence. Barbara sat on a velvet sofa sipping vodka. She watched her son unravel with cold, calculating eyes. "You need to calm down, Bradley," she snapped, setting her glass onto the table. "Panic makes you sloppy. If federal regulators are sniffing around the offshore accounts, we simply give them a bone to chew on. We need a fall guy, someone expendable." Bradley stopped pacing. He stared at his mother, the gears turning in his desperate mind. The embezzlement was tied directly to executive authorizations. If the feds raided the building, they would trace the digital signatures straight back to his internet protocol address. He needed a shield. He needed someone whose job inherently involved overseeing financial regulations, someone who could plausibly be blamed for manipulating the system. His eyes widened as a vile, deeply racist plan formed in his head. "Malik Bradley," said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "He is the director of compliance. It is literally his job to monitor the financial infrastructure. If I route the encrypted transfers through his department firewall and forge his digital authorization keys, the feds will think he orchestrated the entire scheme to bypass my oversight." Barbara smiled, a chilling expression devoid of any human empathy. "It is the perfect narrative," she agreed smoothly. "Let us be honest, Bradley. Your investors already look at Malik like he does not belong in your circle. He is an outsider, a black man who married into our elite family. The board of directors will easily believe that he grew greedy and tried to steal from the very people who gave him a seat at the table." Standing just outside the heavy oak doors of the penthouse office, Cassidy listened to every single word. She had come upstairs to ask her brother for her monthly allowance, only to overhear the horrifying conspiracy to send her own husband to federal prison. For a brief, fleeting moment, a flash of guilt crossed her face. Malik loved her. He had defended her and tolerated her deeply toxic family for years because he believed in their marriage. But Cassidy was a product of her mother's ruthless upbringing. As she listened to Bradley outline how Malik would face decades behind bars, while the rest of the family walked away with their billions, she made a sickening choice. She pushed the office doors open and stepped inside. Bradley and Barbara froze, caught in the middle of their treasonous plotting. But Cassidy simply walked over to the bar, poured herself a drink, and looked at her brother. "Make sure the forged signatures are untraceable back to your computer," she instructed coldly. Barbara let out a breath of relief, proud of her daughter's absolute lack of a moral spine. "You are doing the right thing, sweetie. Malik is a good man, but family always protects family first. He owes us," Cassidy rationalized, taking a sip of her drink without a shred of remorse. "We gave him this lifestyle. We gave him access to a world he never could have entered on his own. If he has to take the fall so we can keep our company and our homes, then that is the price of his admission. He will go to a white-collar facility. We will hire him a decent lawyer." While his wife actively signed his life away, Malik was sitting 2 floors down in the compliance department trying to do his job. The cyber attack alerts from the previous night had put him on high alert. He was meticulously running diagnostic checks on the internal servers, trying to ensure the company was secure ahead of the public offering. He needed to verify a series of executive protocols, which required a hard copy manual from Bradley's private office. Malik took the private elevator up to the penthouse suite. The executive floor was eerily quiet. Bradley and the women had already left for a lunch meeting with their public relations team to continue their smear campaign against me. Malik walked into Bradley's empty office, heading straight for the filing cabinets behind the massive mahogany desk. As he reached for the compliance manuals, he noticed a thick, unlabeled manila folder sitting carelessly on the edge of the desk. Bradley had been so frantic that he had forgotten to lock it away. Malik opened the folder to ensure it did not contain sensitive materials that needed to be secured. What he saw made his blood run completely cold. They were wire transfer authorizations. Massive, staggering sums of money routed to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. But the most horrifying detail was not the stolen millions. It was the signature at the bottom of every single page. It was his own name. His digital authorization codes had been perfectly replicated, stamping his identity onto a $50 million federal crime he knew absolutely nothing about. Malik's hands began to shake. He was holding his own prison sentence in his hands. He grabbed his phone, desperate to take photos of the forged documents to protect himself. A heavy, imposing shadow suddenly fell across the massive mahogany desk. Bradley's head of security stepped inside and locked the door. The heavy click of the deadbolt echoing through the penthouse office made Malik freeze. He slowly lowered the manila folder onto the mahogany desk. Bradley stepped out from the private adjoining bathroom, wiping his hands with a monogrammed towel. He did not look surprised to see his director of compliance holding the forged offshore wire transfers. His head of security, a towering man named Griffin, stood perfectly still against the locked door blocking the only exit. "You always were too thorough for your own good," Malik Bradley said, tossing the towel onto a leather chair. "I was going to wait until tomorrow to bring you into the loop. But since you took the initiative to snoop through my desk, we can expedite the conversation." Malik stared at the man he had called family for 4 years. "You forged my digital signature," Malik stated, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "You routed $50 million of stolen venture capital through the Cayman Islands and stamped my authorization codes on every single transfer. That is wire fraud, Bradley. It carries a 20-year federal sentence." Bradley poured himself a glass of sparkling water, completely unfazed by the threat of federal prison. "It is only wire fraud if the Securities and Exchange Commission finds the hidden ledger," he replied smoothly. "And if they do, they will trace the authorizations directly to your Internet Protocol address. You are the compliance officer. The board will simply assume you bypassed my oversight to enrich yourself." "I will not take the fall for your embezzlement," Malik warned, stepping away from the desk. "I will walk straight into the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office and report you right now." Griffin took a menacing step forward, but Bradley raised a hand to stop him. "If you walk out of this building and go to the feds, I will have Griffin plant proprietary source code on your personal devices." Bradley threatened, his tone dripping with malice. "I will frame you for corporate espionage. I will tell the authorities you were selling our algorithm to foreign competitors and fabricated this entire embezzlement story to cover your tracks. Who do you think a judge will believe? The brilliant, wealthy tech founder taking his company public, or the disgruntled, outsider employee trying to steal trade secrets?" Malik felt the air leave his lungs. Bradley was leveraging every ounce of his systemic privilege to trap him. The ultimatum was sickeningly clear. Play along, sign the final initial public offering disclosures tomorrow, and pray the feds never raided the building, or refuse and face immediate life-ruining criminal charges. You have until tomorrow morning to decide if you want to be a team player." Bradley sneered, gesturing toward the door. Griffin unlocked the deadbolt, stepping aside just enough for Malik to squeeze past. Malik stumbled out of the high-rise building and drove straight to the affluent suburban neighborhood he shared with Cassidy. His mind raced with terrifying scenarios. He needed his wife. He needed the woman who promised to stand by him to help him navigate the nightmare her brother had just created. He found Cassidy sitting by their backyard fire pit, casually scrolling through her phone and drinking a glass of expensive white wine. She did not even look up when he rushed onto the patio. "Cassidy, we need to hire a defense attorney immediately," Malik urged, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Bradley is setting me up for wire fraud. He forged my signature on $50 million worth of illegal offshore transfers. If the federal agents audit the company, I am going to prison." Cassidy finally locked her phone and set it on the glass table. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. Her expression remained completely devoid of shock or empathy. "I know about the transfers, Malik," she said coldly. "I was in the office when he finalized the plan." The sheer callousness of her admission struck Malik like a physical blow. "You knew," he whispered, horrified by the monster sitting in front of him. "You stood there and let your brother frame your own husband for a federal crime." "Do not be dramatic," Cassidy scoffed, rolling her eyes. "The company is going public next week. We are about to be worth billions. If the commission flags the accounts, you just need to take the plea deal. You will go to a minimum security white-collar facility for a few years. We will hire you a fantastic lawyer, and when you get out, we will take care of you. We gave you this lifestyle, Malik. You owe us this sacrifice so the family can keep our wealth." Malik stared at the woman he loved, finally realizing he had never been a husband to her. He had always been an accessory, a token outsider they could parade around to look progressive, and now a convenient scapegoat to slaughter for their financial survival. He was entirely alone. Without saying another word, Malik turned his back on his wife and walked out of the house. He drove aimlessly for hours, suffocating under the heavy weight of his impending doom. Seeking absolute isolation, Malik pulled his car into a dimly lit subterranean parking garage downtown. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring blankly at the stained concrete wall, desperately contemplating how to survive the complete destruction of his professional career and his personal freedom. He was out of viable options. The harsh screech of tires suddenly echoed through the empty concrete structure. A sleek black sport utility vehicle pulled up directly alongside him, aggressively cutting off his only exit route. The tinted passenger door opened smoothly in the shadows. I stepped out onto the damp pavement, wearing a sharp designer suit and holding a thick manila folder. I walked slowly over to his car, making sure he saw me clearly in the dim light, and slid the file across the hood of the car. I know what they are doing to you, Malik. Help me burn his empire to the ground, and I promise you federal immunity. I stood still in the dim parking garage. Malik stared at the manila folder I had just slid across the hood of his car. His eyes darted between the damning documents and my face processing the betrayal his wife and her family engineered. I did not offer him a warm hug or an emotional apology for the cruelty of my husband. Empty sympathy would not keep him out of a federal penitentiary. I offered him the only thing that actually mattered right now, which was a calculated strategy for absolute survival and undeniable retribution. Bradley is preparing to serve you to the Securities and Exchange Commission on a silver platter, I stated, my voice echoing slightly against the concrete walls. He forged your digital signatures on $50 million worth of offshore transfers. When the federal agents raid the building, they will arrest you. Cassidy knows about the plan, and she has already agreed to let you take the fall so she can keep her luxury lifestyle. You have zero allies inside that penthouse. Help me burn his fraudulent empire to the very ground. Malik and I promise you full federal immunity. Malik clenched his jaw, his hands balling into tight fists as the reality of his wife's betrayal settled into his bones. He looked down at the folder again, tracing the forged signatures with his eyes. He was a brilliant compliance officer, a man who had dedicated his entire career to playing by the rules, only to realize the game was entirely rigged against him. He took a long, deep breath and looked back up at me. His expression was no longer one of shock, but of razor-sharp determination. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice low. "I need the master ledger," I replied. "I need the raw, unencrypted server logs that contain the original wire transfer authorizations. The only way to prove Bradley executed the transactions is to pull the data directly from the localized, secure server room on the executive floor. I am handing you a custom decryptor drive. It is disguised to look exactly like a standard corporate access badge. You need to plug it directly into the mainframe and extract the data before Bradley realizes we are onto him and destroys the hardware." Malik took the disguised decryptor drive, slipping it carefully into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. We finalized the extraction timeline and parted ways in the shadows. The next morning, however, the mission became exponentially more dangerous. Bradley had grown deeply paranoid after the Securities and Exchange Commission inquiry. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were highly unpredictable. As soon as Malik arrived at the corporate headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Bradley called an emergency mandatory meeting for all top-level executives in the main boardroom. He paced at the front of the room, his eyes darting suspiciously around the table. He announced a sudden, immediate zero-trust security protocol across the entire company. Before anyone could even raise a single objection, Bradley directed his heavily armed private security team to confiscate every single personal cellular device, tablet, and flash drive in the room. He proudly declared that he had blocked all cloud access and disabled external routing for every executive network account, including the compliance department. Malik sat at the polished mahogany table, forcing his expression to remain completely neutral, while his heart hammered against his ribs. He silently watched the muscular security chief drop his confiscated phone into a reinforced lockbox.
Bradley had effectively severed all internal communication lines and trapped the master ledger behind an impenetrable digital wall. The extraction had just gone from a high-stakes heist to a seemingly impossible suicide mission. But Bradley severely underestimated the resources of a premier forensic auditing firm. I had anticipated a severe lockdown protocol. Sitting in my secure command center miles away, my strike team watched the corporate network traffic flatline as Bradley initiated his zero-trust environment. We needed to create a massive, undeniable distraction to pull the security team away from the executive floor. I gave my lead cyber analyst the green light. At precisely 10 o'clock, my firm launched a highly targeted, aggressive distributed denial of service attack directly against the external firewall of Bradley's company. Inside the corporate headquarters, absolute pandemonium erupted. The overhead security lights flashed a blinding crimson red. The automated cyber alarms began blaring a deafening, high-pitched warning throughout every hallway of the massive building. Analysts and executives poured out of their offices in a panic, shouting about a catastrophic data breach. The entire information technology department went into a frenzy, scrambling desperately to counter the external threat that was seemingly tearing down their primary defense walls. Bradley sprinted out of his penthouse office, screaming at his security chief to lock down the external servers. In the midst of the total chaos, Malik seized his only window of opportunity. While the security detail rushed toward the main control hub to isolate the perceived breach, Malik slipped away from the panicked crowd. He moved with swift, silent purpose down the empty executive corridor, heading straight for the localized secure server room. He swiped his biometric credentials at the heavy steel door. The light flashed green, granting him access. Malik stepped into the freezing, dimly lit server room, the hum of massive processors drowning out the blaring alarms from the hallway. He moved quickly to the primary mainframe terminal, pulling my custom decryptor drive from his inner jacket pocket. He plugged the disguised badge directly into the central port. The terminal screen flickered, bypassing the internal security protocols, and a progress bar appeared on the monitor. Malik watched the extraction sequence initiate. The data transfer was agonizingly slow. The digital progress bar crept upward. 50%, 70%, 85%, 95%. Sweat beaded on his dark forehead. 98%. The heavy steel door behind him clicked loudly and swung open. The heavy steel door of the localized secure server room swung open with a harsh electronic buzz. Malik barely had a fraction of a second to react. With lightning-fast reflexes born of pure survival instinct, he yanked my custom decryptor drive from the mainframe port and shoved it straight up the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket. He immediately pivoted toward the doorway, grabbing a nearby diagnostic tablet to blend into the chaotic environment. Bradley stepped into the freezing room, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Right behind him was Griffin, the towering head of corporate security, who looked ready to snap someone in half. The blaring cyber alarms from the hallway echoed loudly behind them, painting the server racks in ominous flashes of red light. "What are you doing in here?" Bradley demanded, his voice slicing through the mechanical hum of the processors. "The entire building is under a massive external cyber attack, and you are standing in the one room that holds our most critical financial data." Malik kept his posture completely relaxed, leaning slightly against the server rack to project an aura of total calm. "I am doing my job, Bradley," Malik replied, his tone perfectly steady. "The external firewall is buckling under a distributed denial of service attack. As your director of compliance, protocol dictates that I immediately initiate a localized emergency backup of our regulatory filings before the servers are potentially compromised. I am isolating the compliance ledgers right now." It was a brilliant, flawless excuse. It aligned perfectly with his job description and the current corporate panic. But Bradley was not thinking like a rational chief executive officer anymore. He was thinking like a guilty, cornered criminal who had just forged $50 million worth of offshore transfers using the exact name of the man standing in front of him. Bradley narrowed his eyes, stepping closer. The paranoid suspicion rolling off him was palpable. You do not initiate a physical backup during an active breach without my direct authorization, Bradley snarled. Step away from the terminal. Malik did not move fast enough for Bradley's liking. In a sudden explosive burst of violence, Bradley lunged forward. He shoved his hands violently against Malik's chest, slamming the compliance director hard against the metal server rack. The heavy impact knocked the breath right out of Malik's lungs. Griffin instantly moved in, grabbing Malik by the collar and pinning him aggressively against the cold steel. "Search him," Bradley ordered, his eyes wide with frantic paranoia. "Search everything." Griffin patted Malik down with brutal efficiency. He checked his pockets, his waistline, and the inside of his jacket. Malik kept his right arm pinned awkwardly against his side, praying the security chief would not feel the small ridge of the decryptor drive hidden deep within his sleeve cuff. Griffin pulled Malik's company-issued smartphone from his pocket and tossed it onto the console. Then he grabbed the thick silver laptop sitting on the server cart next to Malik. "He is clean, sir," Griffin grunted, holding up the laptop. "Just the phone and the computer." Bradley snatched the laptop from Griffin's massive hands, staring at it as if it were a ticking bomb. He looked back at Malik, a vicious, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "You really thought you could play me?" Bradley whispered maliciously. "You thought you could sneak in here during a network crash and gather evidence to save your own skin. You are pathetic, Malik. You are just a parasite who thought marrying my sister gave you a free pass to my empire." "I was securing the company files," Malik stated, firmly maintaining eye contact, despite being pinned against the metal racks. "You are fired," Bradley spat, clutching the laptop tightly to his chest. "You are terminated immediately for violating the zero-trust security protocol I implemented this morning. You have no severance, no stock options, and absolutely no future in Silicon Valley." Griffin marched this traitor out the back freight elevator and throw him onto the street. "If he ever steps foot on my property again, break his legs." Griffin roughly yanked Malik away from the servers, shoving him toward the exit. Malik did not fight back. He allowed himself to be manhandled down the executive corridor, shoved into the freight elevator, and marched through the damp service alley behind the corporate headquarters. Griffin forcefully shoved him through the heavy loading dock doors, sending Malik stumbling onto the wet pavement before slamming the door shut and locking it from the inside. Up in the penthouse, the blaring cyber alarms finally began to quiet down as my firm intentionally pulled back the network attack. Bradley stood in the center of his lavish office, the confiscated laptop resting securely on his mahogany desk. He poured himself a generous glass of bourbon, his hands finally stopping their frantic shaking. He pulled out his phone and dialed his mother. Barbara answered at the second ring. "Tell me you secured the building," she demanded. "It is done," Mom. Bradley laughed, taking a long sip of his drink. "The cyber attack was just a scare. But better yet, I caught Malik creeping around the server room trying to pull files. I confiscated his laptop and his phone, and I threw him out on the street. I have all his devices. He has zero proof, and his digital fingerprints are permanently stamped on those offshore transfers. We eliminated the only liability in the company. The initial public offering is completely safe." Down on the dark, rain-slicked street, Malik adjusted his suit jacket and walked 2 blocks to a dimly lit subterranean parking garage. A sleek black sport utility vehicle idled quietly in the shadows. The passenger door opened and I stepped out, leaning against the frame. "Did you get the data?" I asked quietly. Malik smiled for the first time. The small piece of plastic felt practically weightless, yet it carried enough raw evidence to dismantle a corrupt corporate empire and send my husband to federal prison for decades. I nodded to Malik, instructed him to lay low at a highly secure safe house my firm had prepared in the mountains, and immediately drove back to my underground command center in the financial district. Nathaniel was already pacing the length of the main conference room when I pushed through the frosted glass doors. My lead data analyst took the tiny memory card and plugged it directly into our isolated mainframe. The room went completely silent as the decrypted files flooded the massive holographic display covering the front wall. This was the master ledger, the unedited, raw financial history of Bradley's tech startup.
There were no polished marketing metrics or fabricated user acquisition numbers here. This was the undeniable truth. The data transfer completed, and my elite strike team began tearing into the files with ruthless efficiency. We cross-referenced the internal authorizations against the public filings Bradley had submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The discrepancy was not just a minor accounting error. It was a massive calculated financial hemorrhage designed to enrich one man at the expense of everyone else. Look at these outgoing wire transfers, I instructed, pointing a laser pointer at a cascading series of red numbers on the primary monitor. Over the past 3 years, Bradley has systematically drained over $50 million from his primary venture capital accounts. He disguised the thefts as legitimate research and development expenses, paying exorbitant consulting fees to 3 distinct software contractors. But the contractors do not actually exist. My cyber analysts quickly traced the routing numbers attached to the vendor invoices. The money flowed out of Silicon Valley, bounced through a series of anonymous digital wallets to scramble the origin, and landed directly into a network of highly obscured shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. Bradley had set up an automated laundering cycle. Every time his startup secured a new round of funding, he skimmed exactly 15% right off the top. He used the stolen capital to buy luxury real estate, a fleet of high-end sports cars, and to fund the lavish lifestyle he proudly paraded on social media. But he was getting incredibly greedy. As the initial public offering drew closer, the frequency of the offshore transfers accelerated dangerously. He was trying to cash out as much as possible before the public market regulators could officially audit his books and discover the massive hole in his operating capital. I opened a secondary window on the display, pulling up the complex ownership structure of the private equity funds that Bradley had been actively defrauding. If we were going to hand this catastrophic data over to the federal authorities, we needed to identify the exact victims of the wire fraud to ensure maximum criminal charges. As I ran a deep background search on the holding companies that provided Bradley's Series B and Series C funding, a bizarre pattern emerged. The holding companies were layered under several different corporate umbrellas, intentionally designed to mask the primary beneficiary. I deployed a recursive algorithm to strip away the corporate layers one by one. The progress bar hit 100%, revealing a single overarching parent conglomerate. I froze, staring at the screen in absolute shock. I turned slowly to look at Nathaniel, who had moved to stand directly behind my chair. Nathaniel leaned over the monitors, his broad shoulders casting a dark shadow across the illuminated desk. He stared at the corporate logo displayed on the wall, a dangerous, predatory smile slowly forming on his face. He did not just steal from anyone, Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a chillingly calm register. He stole from my subsidiaries. The revelation changed the entire dynamic of our operation. Bradley had not just defrauded faceless institutional investors. He had actively stolen $50 million from one of the most ruthless activist billionaire investors in the entire world. Nathaniel was no longer just a wealthy client hiring my forensic auditing firm to evaluate a hostile takeover bid. He was now a direct victim of massive wire fraud, and he was out for absolute blood. We spent the next 48 hours weaponizing every single piece of data on that memory card, preparing a bulletproof, undeniable dossier for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the financial regulators. Early Thursday morning, as we were finalizing the prosecution timeline, a heavily armed private courier arrived at my secure facility. He bypassed the front desk and handed my head of security a thick velvet-lined envelope stamped with a gold wax seal. I opened it in the center of the conference room while my team watched. It was a formal invitation printed on heavy, expensive cardstock. Bradley was hosting a massive, lavish pre-initial public offering celebration on a rented mega yacht in the San Francisco Bay. The exclusive guest list included the most elite tech journalists, venture capitalists, and industry influencers in California. Tucked inside the formal invitation was a handwritten note from my husband. I read the arrogant, looping handwriting aloud to the silent room. "Come watch me become a billionaire. I have a special announcement about your extracurricular activities." He actually thought he still had the upper hand. He believed he was going to use this glamorous event to publicly destroy my reputation one final time, completely unaware that he had just invited his own executioner onto the water. I looked at Nathaniel, who was already calling his security team to arrange our transport. The trap was set, and it was time to sink my husband's ship. We had exactly 48 hours until Bradley hosted his extravagant yacht party. The underground command center transformed into an absolute war room. Nathaniel Malik and my elite strike team worked around the clock, refusing to sleep until the trap was perfectly constructed. We took the raw data Malik had extracted from the secure server and methodically built an undeniable bulletproof dossier. Every single fraudulent wire transfer, every offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, and every forged digital signature was strictly cross-referenced and compiled into a massive digital archive. I personally drafted the official reporting documents for the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. There was absolutely no room for error or hesitation. We were not just accusing a high-profile chief executive officer of embezzlement. We were preparing to execute a complete corporate takedown on live television. Malik reviewed the final federal immunity agreement my legal team had drafted. His hands were perfectly steady as he signed his name on the dotted line, officially severing his ties to the toxic family that had actively tried to throw him in a federal prison to save their own wealth. Nathaniel stepped away from the main conference table to make a highly confidential private phone call. He leveraged his immense status as a billionaire investor to contact a highly placed director at the Department of Justice. Nathaniel arranged a very special delivery for the yacht party, coordinating a joint strike task force to sit quietly in the dark waters of the San Francisco Bay, waiting patiently for my specific signal. Bradley actually thought he was throwing the pre-initial public offering party of the decade. He had no idea we were setting up the biggest active crime scene in California history. When the final financial dossier was securely encrypted and successfully transmitted to the federal authorities, I left the command center to prepare for the gala. 2 days ago, I had sat in a grand ballroom wearing a simple handmade dress, enduring the absolute humiliation of being auctioned off for $22 by the man I had supported for 5 years. Tonight, I was not going to be the modest, invisible accountant, fading quietly into the background to make her husband look brilliant. I was the managing director of a premier forensic auditing firm, and it was time I looked exactly like the ruthless corporate executioner I truly was. I walked into an exclusive designer boutique downtown and purchased a razor-sharp tailored crimson suit. The rich fabric was immaculate, the cut severe, powerful, and commanding. I paired it with sleek black stilettos and minimalist gold jewelry that caught the light perfectly. I paid for the entire expensive ensemble using my own corporate platinum card funded entirely by the massive success of the business I had built in the shadows, while my husband called me useless. Standing in front of the full-length mirror in my hotel suite, I barely recognized the fierce woman looking back at me. The exhausted, submissive wife who had worked 3 jobs to pay Bradley's mortgage was completely gone forever. In her place stood a woman holding the absolute destruction of a fraudulent tech empire right in the palm of her hand. I grabbed my evening clutch, which contained the custom remote override device my cyber team had built, and confidently headed straight for the bustling harbor. The San Francisco Bay sparkled brightly under the night sky, reflecting the massive glowing structure of the rented mega yacht. The multi-level vessel was a towering, floating monument to Bradley's stolen wealth and unchecked arrogance. Security at the gangway was incredibly tight, but the formal invitation Bradley had mockingly sent me granted me immediate, unquestioned access past the heavily armed guards. I stepped onto the polished teak deck and took in the sheer audacity of the celebration. The massive main deck was completely overflowing with Silicon Valley elites, influential tech journalists holding cameras, and wealthy venture capitalists eager to get a lucrative piece of tomorrow's initial public offering. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated smoothly with silver trays of vintage champagne and imported beluga caviar. Massive light-emitting diode screens were rigged around the perimeter, displaying the company logo. Across the crowded room, I easily spotted my mother-in-law Barbara and my sister-in-law Cassidy. They were holding court near the main ice sculpture, absolutely dripping in massive diamonds that were paid for entirely with embezzled private equity funds. Barbara was laughing loudly, parading around as if she were untouchable tech royalty, completely oblivious to the fact that her luxurious lifestyle was built on a massive federal crime. Cassidy clung to a group of wealthy investors' wives, aggressively playing the role of the elite socialite. They looked so incredibly smug, so certain that they had won the ultimate victory by driving me out of their lives and securing their billion-dollar future. I took a deep, steadying breath, straightened my crimson jacket, and walked directly into the center of the crowded deck. I walked in completely alone, needing no one to hold my hand or fight my battles. The exact moment the wealthy investors and socialites noticed me, a harsh, buzzing wave of whispers swept rapidly through the crowd. People pointed and murmured behind their champagne glasses, fully expecting me to cause a desperate, emotional, and pathetic scene. The journalists immediately raised their digital cameras, hungry for a scandalous headline. Up on the grand sweeping staircase overlooking the main deck, Bradley suddenly appeared. He looked down and saw me standing confidently in the absolute center of the silent crowd. A look of pure, unadulterated malice flashed rapidly across his flushed face. He stepped toward the balcony railing, gripping the steel tightly as he stared down at the woman he had severely underestimated for years. He grabbed a microphone from the elevated podium, locking his dark eyes onto mine with a vicious, triumphant smirk, entirely ready to destroy me publicly. Bradley stood at the elevated podium overlooking the main deck of the yacht, his hands gripping the edges of the polished wood. The soft evening breeze of the San Francisco Bay ruffled his expensive tuxedo, but his eyes were burning with a toxic, desperate energy. He raised the microphone to his lips, making sure every venture capitalist, journalist, and socialite in the crowd was hanging on his every word. He began his speech with the practiced, arrogant charm that had fooled so many investors. He welcomed his elite guests to the celebration of his upcoming initial public offering, painting a magnificent picture of his own supposed brilliance. He spun a narrative about late nights, tireless innovation, and single-handedly building a tech empire from nothing. Then his voice dropped an octave, dripping with manufactured sorrow. He told the crowd that every successful man faces obstacles, but his greatest obstacle had been a deeply toxic, gold-digging wife who tried to destroy him right at the finish line. The journalists in the crowd eagerly raised their digital recorders. Barbara and Cassidy stood near the ice sculpture, smirking and nodding in exaggerated sympathy. Bradley gestured grandly toward me, standing alone in my crimson suit in the center of the deck. He commanded the lighting technician to hit me with the spotlight. A blinding white beam illuminated me against the dark night. He announced to the silent watching crowd that he was not just going to tell them about my betrayal, but he was going to show them. He held up a sleek wireless presentation remote, declaring he had gathered undeniable proof of my supposed affairs and financial extortion, ready to project my absolute ruin onto the massive light, emitting diode screens rigged behind the stage. Bradley flashed a vicious, triumphant smile. He aimed the remote at the projection booth and dramatically pressed the button. Nothing happened. Bradley frowned, pressing the button a second time harder. Still nothing. The giant screens behind him remained pitch black. A few uncomfortable whispers began to ripple through the crowd of wealthy investors. Bradley tapped the microphone, glaring up at the technical crew in the upper booth, angrily demanding that they run his presentation immediately. I did not wait for him to figure out the technical difficulty. I slowly raised my right hand, holding up a small, custom-built remote override device my cyberstrike team had engineered specifically for this exact moment. I pressed a single button. The massive screens behind Bradley instantly flickered to life. But they did not show fabricated tabloid photos or fake text messages. They displayed a blindingly bright, highly complex series of financial spreadsheets. The raw, unfiltered data of his company illuminated the entire deck. I stepped out of the blinding spotlight and began walking purposefully toward the sweeping staircase. The crowd parted for me in absolute silence. My heels clicked sharply against the teak deck, a rhythmic countdown to my husband's total destruction. I walked right up the stairs and stopped just a few feet away from the podium. Bradley stared at me, his face draining of all color as he looked at the device in my hand.
"You called me a useless wife worth $22 an hour," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the ambient noise of the party. "You told these people I sat in a basement crunching numbers while you built an empire. Let us see what those $22 actually bought you, Bradley." I clicked the override remote again. The screens behind him zoomed in on the first set of financial ledgers. I turned to face the crowd of confused, whispering investors and journalists. "For 5 years, my husband claimed he was a visionary," I announced, maintaining absolute authority in my tone. "What he actually is a profound liability. The numbers you are looking at on that screen are the real unedited tax filings and operating costs of his company. For 5 years, he burned through venture capital on luxury cars, unnecessary marketing retreats, and bloated executive salaries. The only reason this company did not file for bankruptcy 3 years ago is because of my meticulous, brilliant accounting. I personally restructured every failing debt, renegotiated every defaulted vendor contract, and built the entire financial infrastructure that kept his sinking ship afloat. My $22 an hour labor was the only thing hiding his staggering incompetence from all of you." Bradley lunged for the microphone, his hands shaking violently as he tried to shout over me, but my cyber team had already severed the audio feed to his podium. He was completely muted, mouthing desperate, silent curses. The venture capitalists in the crowd began pointing at the screens, their faces twisting in alarm as they read the detailed, undeniable proof of extreme financial mismanagement. "But incompetence is not a federal crime," I continued, my voice ringing out strong and steady as I looked directly into Bradley's terrified eyes. "Embezzlement is." I clicked the remote one final time. The screen wiped the old spreadsheets away. In their place, a new set of documents appeared in glaring, high-definition clarity. These were not internal operating budgets, they were bank-certified wire transfer authorizations. Massive, undeniable transactions showing millions of dollars moving out of the primary investor accounts. The crowd erupted into chaotic shouting. The journalists frantically began snapping photographs of the glowing screens. The wire transfers were highlighted in bright red, tracing the stolen funds as they bounced through anonymous digital wallets and landed directly into a network of highly obscured shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I pointed at the screen, then pointed directly at my husband. "That is where your investment capital actually went," I declared to the crowd. "He did not invest your money into technology or infrastructure. He stole $50 million right out of your pockets to buy his mother a mansion and purchase this very yacht." His entire fraudulent tech empire was now completely finished forever. The collective gasp from the 400 elite guests was deafening. It rippled across the polished teak deck of the mega yacht like a physical shockwave. Tech journalists frantically aimed their digital cameras at the massive light, emitting diode screens, illuminating the night sky, capturing every single damning wire transfer in high definition. Wealthy venture capitalists, the very people who had just poured millions into Bradley's upcoming initial public offering, stared at the glowing offshore account routing numbers with absolute horror. Their champagne glasses lowered as the catastrophic reality set in. They had been defrauded, and the proof was broadcasting live at their own celebration. Bradley's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He scrambled backward, tripping over the microphone stand. "Turn it off!" he screamed, his voice raw and cracking as he frantically waved his arms at the upper projection booth. "Security! Get up there and cut the power right now. Shut those screens down and get this crazy woman off my stage." Two muscular corporate security guards immediately broke away from the crowd and sprinted toward the metal staircase leading to the audio-visual control room. But before their heavy boots could even touch the first step, a solid wall of black-suited men materialized from the shadows of the VIP section. Nathaniel stepped forward, his towering presence instantly commanding the chaotic deck. He did not need to shout to be heard. He simply raised a single hand, and his highly trained private security detail moved with terrifying military precision. They formed a physical barricade around the projection booth and flanked the stage, their hands resting deliberately near their holsters. The message was explicitly clear. No one was touching those screens. "Let the lady finish her presentation,"
Bradley, Nathaniel commanded, his deep voice slicing through the frantic murmurs of the investors. I find this financial report incredibly fascinating, and I highly suggest everyone here pays very close attention. Bradley swallowed hard, trapped on the stage. He looked desperately at his mother Barbara, who was standing frozen near the melting ice sculpture. Her diamond necklace suddenly looked less like a status symbol and more like a glowing beacon of federal evidence. Cassidy clutched her mother's arm, her smug socialite persona completely shattered by the impending threat of poverty and prison. I turned my attention back to the terrified crowd of investors. I clicked my remote override device again, and the screen zoomed in on the complex ownership structures of the Cayman Island shell companies. I walked across the stage, my crimson suit stark against the glaring white light of the monitors. My husband wants you to believe I am a bitter, vindictive spouse making up lies to ruin his big day, I announced, ensuring my tone carried absolute, unwavering authority. But I am not a scorned housewife, and I am certainly not a boring accountant. I am the managing director of a premier forensic auditing firm that specializes in dismantling corporate fraud syndicates for federal agencies. You did not invest in a visionary tech startup. You invested in a highly sophisticated laundering operation designed to funnel your capital straight into my husband's private offshore accounts. Bradley wiped the sweat dripping down his forehead. He pointed a finger at me. "She is lying," he shouted to the crowd, his voice shrill with desperation. "Those documents are completely fabricated. She hacked my servers and planted fake wire transfers to extort me. This is corporate sabotage." I did not flinch at his pathetic attempt to deflect the blame. I turned slowly to face him. "I did not plant anything, Bradley," I replied coldly. "I simply exposed the automated laundering cycle you set up 3 years ago. You skimmed 15% off every single funding round, but you made one catastrophic, monumentally stupid mistake. You did not just steal from faceless institutional investors to inflate your initial public offering valuation." I gestured toward the tall billionaire standing at the edge of the stage. "You stole from Nathaniel," I revealed, letting the absolute weight of that statement crash down upon my husband. "The private equity funds you drained belong directly to his corporate subsidiaries." Bradley stumbled backward, his knees practically buckling under the weight of his colossal error. He stared at Nathaniel with wide, terrified eyes. Stealing from a standard venture capital firm was a severe federal crime. Stealing $50 million from a ruthless activist billionaire who specialized in hostile takeovers was an absolute death sentence. Nathaniel offered Bradley a predatory, ice-cold smile. "You really should have vetted your investor portfolio better," Bradley Nathaniel stated smoothly. "Or at the very least, you should have treated your wife with a little more respect." The panic in Bradley's eyes shifted into cornered, desperate madness. He looked wildly around the yacht, searching for any possible exit, any scapegoat to shield him from the incoming federal hammer. His eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man standing quietly near the back of the deck. Malik Bradley screamed, pointing frantically into the sea of shocked investors. Tell them she is lying. Malik is the director of compliance. He oversees the entire financial infrastructure of this company. He signed off on every single regulatory filing. If those offshore transfers are real, he is the one who authorized them. I have his digital signatures on file to prove it." The crowd parted as Malik stepped forward. He looked completely calm. He did not look intimidated by the wealthy elites staring at him. He walked steadily toward the stage, reaching inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He pulled out a thick folded document bearing the official unmistakable seal of the Department of Justice. Malik looked up at the man who had tried to frame him for a 20-year federal felony. "I did not sign anything," Bradley Malik stated, his voice ringing out with absolute clarity and undeniable justice. "But I did sign this federal immunity agreement this morning." The heavy, unyielding silence that followed Malik's declaration lasted only a fraction of a second before the entire main deck of the mega yacht completely erupted. Absolute, unadulterated pandemonium broke loose among the 400 elite guests. The realization that a federal immunity agreement was already in play meant the Department of Justice was not just investigating the company. They were already preparing the indictments.
Venture capitalists who had been sipping vintage champagne moments ago were now frantically shouting into their cellular phones, desperately ordering their brokers to dump every single share and completely pull their capital out of the upcoming initial public offering. The panicked voices blended into a chaotic, deafening roar that echoed across the dark waters of the San Francisco Bay. Bradley's knees finally gave out. The arrogant tech founder collapsed right onto the polished teak deck, his expensive tuxedo crumpling as he fell. He stared blankly at the massive light-emitting diode screens that were still brightly broadcasting his $50 million embezzlement to the entire world. The carefully constructed billion-dollar empire he had built on a foundation of theft and my unpaid labor was dissolving into absolute nothingness in real time. He grabbed his hair, his mouth opening and closing in silent, hyperventilating terror. He had no more scapegoats to slaughter. There were no more lies he could spin. The federal government had the master ledger, and his own director of compliance had officially flipped. Near the melting ice sculpture, the reality of the situation finally pierced through Cassidy's deep delusion of superiority. The realization that her brother was going to federal prison and her family's stolen wealth was about to be entirely seized by the government hit her like a physical blow. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered sharply against the deck, but the sound was completely swallowed by the shouting crowd. Cassidy shoved her way past a group of fleeing tech journalists, her diamond necklace flashing under the harsh stage lights. She sprinted directly toward Malik, who was standing tall and perfectly composed next to the stage. Real tears streamed down Cassidy's face, completely ruining her immaculate designer makeup. She grabbed Malik by the arm, her manicured fingers digging desperately into the sleeve of his tailored suit. "Malik, please," she sobbed loudly, trying to pull him away from the glaring spotlights. "You have to stop this. You know all the financial regulators. You can fix this mess. You are my husband, Malik. We are family. You have to help my brother before they arrest him." Malik did not flinch. He did not step back, but he also did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. He looked down at the woman he had loved, the woman he had sworn to protect, and saw nothing but a selfish, terrified parasite who was perfectly willing to let him rot in a federal penitentiary just to maintain her luxurious lifestyle. The absolute audacity she had to invoke the word family after she had coldly agreed to frame him for a 20-year felony was sickening. Malik gently but firmly reached over and peeled her desperate fingers off his arm, dropping her hand as if it carried a toxic disease. "I am not your scapegoat anymore," Cassidy Malik stated, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "You stood in that penthouse office and agreed to let your brother forge my digital signatures. You decided that my freedom was a fair price to pay so you could keep buying expensive dresses with stolen money. You do not get to call me your husband ever again." Cassidy stumbled backward, her mouth trembling as she tried to formulate another manipulative excuse. But Malik did not give her the chance to speak. He reached inside the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He held it out to her. "What is that?" Cassidy asked, her voice cracking with fresh panic as she stared at the brown paper. "Those are your divorce papers," Malik replied coldly, pressing the envelope directly into her trembling hands. "My legal team filed them with the county court this morning, right after I signed my federal immunity deal. You have exactly 30 days to respond. I suggest you find a very good, very cheap lawyer, because the government is about to freeze every single bank account associated with your family name." Cassidy let out a devastated, piercing wail, clutching the manila envelope to her chest as she collapsed to her knees right next to her brother. Barbara rushed over, trying to shield her disgraced children from the flashing cameras of the ruthless tech journalists who were happily documenting the entire downfall of the Golden family. The socialites who had praised Barbara just an hour ago were now actively backing away from her, treating the disgraced matriarch like a complete pariah. I stood on the stage watching the absolute destruction of the people who had treated me like disposable garbage. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settling into my bones. I had not destroyed them. I had simply turned on the lights and let the world see the monsters hiding in the dark.
Nathaniel walked up the steps and stood beside me, his private security team maintaining the impenetrable perimeter around the stage. He looked out at the panicking crowd and then down at Bradley, who was still rocking back and forth on the deck. "It is almost time," Nathaniel said quietly, checking his heavy silver wristwatch. Right on cue, a piercing high-decibel siren sliced through the cool night air. The frantic shouting on the main deck instantly ceased as every single guest froze in place. A sweeping, blinding searchlight cut through the darkness of the bay, illuminating the massive yacht. The loud, rhythmic chopping of heavy helicopter blades echoed from above. 3 heavily armored Coast Guard tactical vessels rapidly emerged from the dark, freezing waters of the bay, completely cutting off escape. The blinding spotlights from the armored Coast Guard vessels swept across the mega yacht, turning the luxurious celebration into a chaotic federal crime scene. The deafening blare of the sirens vibrating through the hull sent the remaining venture capitalists and tech journalists scrambling away from the railings. The realization that they were entirely trapped on a floating vessel with federal agents boarding sent a fresh wave of panic through the elite crowd. I stood perfectly still next to Nathaniel, watching the inescapable reality finally crash down on the man who had tormented me for 5 long years. Bradley stared wide-eyed at the agents preparing to breach the lower deck. His arrogant facade completely shattered, replaced by the primal, terrifying realization that he was about to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. The undeniable proof of his $50 million embezzlement was still burning brightly on the massive screens behind him. His own brother-in-law had secured federal immunity and handed over the encrypted server logs. There were no more lies left to tell, no more scapegoats to slaughter, and no way to talk himself out of a federal indictment. He completely lost his mind. Instead of surrendering with whatever shred of dignity he had left, Bradley made a desperate, cowardly decision. He spun around, shoving his way past a group of terrified investors, and made a mad dash toward the rear of the yacht. He knew exactly where the private emergency speedboat was docked. It was a high-performance watercraft designed for rapid deployment, fully fueled and ready to go. If he could reach the lowering mechanism, he foolishly believed he could outrun the Coast Guard in the dark waters of the bay and disappear into the night. He sprinted across the polished teak deck, his expensive tuxedo jacket flapping wildly behind him. He violently pushed aside anyone in his path, knocking a server carrying a tray of vintage champagne to the deck. The glass shattered everywhere, but Bradley did not even look back. He reached the stern of the yacht and frantically grabbed the heavy metal winch control box, his hands shaking so badly he could barely punch in the security access code to release the speedboat into the water. But he was never going to make it off that yacht. Nathaniel had anticipated exactly how a cornered narcissist would react when his power was entirely stripped away. Before Bradley could even hit the deployment button, 3 members of Nathaniel's elite private security detail intercepted him. The muscular guards closed in with terrifying speed, cutting off his only route of escape. They did not draw weapons, but their imposing physical presence formed an impenetrable human wall between my husband and his getaway vehicle. Bradley let out a guttural, desperate scream. He fought like a cornered rat, completely abandoning his polished chief executive officer persona. He wildly threw punches at the highly trained security team, kicking and flailing in a blind, pathetic panic to save himself. The guards simply absorbed his frantic blows, effortlessly twisting his arms behind his back to neutralize the threat. Barbara, who had been watching her golden child unravel from the center of the deck, suddenly rushed forward. She pushed through the murmuring crowd, her heavy diamond necklace swinging wildly against her chest. She screamed for the security guards to let her son go, frantically reaching out to grab Bradley's shoulder and pull him away from the men holding him down. Bradley was completely blinded by his own frantic desire to escape. He violently jerked his body sideways to break free from the security team. In his reckless, flailing struggle, he swung his elbow backward with massive force. The heavy blow caught Barbara squarely in the chest. My mother-in-law let out a sharp gasp as her own son knocked her completely off balance. She stumbled backward, her high heels slipping on the spilled champagne, and crashed hard onto the solid teak deck. Cassidy shrieked, rushing over to help her mother up. But Bradley did not even stop to check if the woman who had enabled his toxic behavior for decades was injured. He just kept struggling against the guards, completely consumed by his own selfish desperation. A harsh, commanding voice suddenly boomed over a heavy megaphone from the lower deck. "Federal agents. Nobody move." The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed up the grand sweeping staircase. A dozen Federal Bureau of Investigation agents wearing dark tactical gear swarmed the main deck of the yacht. The tech elites and wealthy investors immediately backed away, raising their hands in silent surrender. The lead federal agent, a tall woman with a steely expression, marched directly through the parted crowd toward the stern of the boat. Nathaniel's security team stepped back, officially handing the disgraced tech founder over to the federal authorities. The lead agent grabbed Bradley by the collar of his ruined tuxedo, violently forcing him to his knees on the hard wooden deck. She pulled heavy steel handcuffs from her tactical belt and clamped them tightly around his wrists. Bradley whimpered, the sound pathetic and small, as the cold metal locked into place. "Bradley, you are under arrest," the lead agent announced, her voice carrying absolute, undeniable authority across the silent yacht. "You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and the direct embezzlement of $50 million. Barbara struggled to her feet, leaning heavily against Cassidy. Her designer dress was soaked in spilled champagne, her perfect hair completely ruined. She looked at her son kneeling in federal handcuffs, and then her furious, erratic gaze locked directly onto me. Her eyes burned with an irrational, explosive hatred. She refused to accept that her son was a criminal. In her twisted mind, this massive public execution was entirely my fault. Barbara let out a primal, enraged scream. She suddenly lunged forward, closing the distance between us before anyone could react, and slapped me violently across the face. The sharp, heavy, brutal impact of Barbara striking my right cheek echoed across the silent deck of the mega yacht. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow, and a dull, throbbing heat immediately began to radiate across my skin. I did not raise my hand to touch my face. I did not stagger backward, and I certainly did not retaliate. I stood my ground, turning my head slowly to look directly into the wild, unhinged eyes of my mother-in-law. She was breathing heavily, her expensive designer gown stained with spilled champagne, still operating under the severe delusion that her wealth and status somehow placed her above the law. She expected me to crumble, to cry, or to physically fight back, which would only feed her twisted narrative that I was the unstable instigator of this entire disaster. Instead, I maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact and simply shifted my gaze to the lead federal agent standing less than 2 feet away from us. The Federal Bureau of Investigation agent did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Before Barbara could even pull her hand back to her side, the agent lunged forward with terrifying speed and professional precision. She grabbed Barbara by the wrist, twisting her arm forcefully behind her back, and spun the wealthy socialite around to face the railing of the yacht. Barbara let out a sharp, shocked gasp as her chest was pressed hard against the cold metal railing. The heavy click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly closed echoed in the night air. "What are you doing?" Barbara shrieked, her voice cracking with indignant outrage as she struggled fruitlessly against the agent's iron grip. "Unhand me right now. Do you know who I am? You cannot arrest me for disciplining an insolent, lying girl. I demand that you release me this instant." The federal agent did not offer a polite warning or a gentle reprimand. "You are under arrest for assaulting a cooperating federal witness," the agent stated, her voice projecting absolute authority over the frantic protests. "You just committed a severe federal offense right in front of a dozen armed officers. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you start using it immediately before I add resisting arrest to your growing list of charges." Cassidy stood frozen near the melting ice sculpture, her hands covering her mouth in pure, genuine horror as she watched her mother being read her Miranda rights. The untouchable matriarch of their golden family was now reduced to a frantic, sobbing criminal wearing federal steel bracelets. The lead agent signaled to her tactical team, and they began the highly coordinated process of removing their high-profile targets from the vessel. The elite guests of Silicon Valley watched in absolute dead silence as the supposed genius chief executive officer and his arrogant mother were marched down the grand staircase of their own party yacht. It was the ultimate, inescapable walk of shame.
The flashing red and blue lights from the heavily armored Coast Guard vessels anchored in the bay cast ominous shadows across the deck, completely washing out the glamorous stage lighting. Tech journalists eagerly pressed forward to the edges of the security perimeter, their digital cameras firing rapidly. They captured every humiliating second of Bradley stumbling down the teak steps in his ruined tuxedo, his hands locked tightly behind his back. The wealthy venture capitalists who had blindly praised him just an hour ago now turned their backs disgusted by the sheer magnitude of his financial deception. Every shred of dignity, power, and respect Bradley and Barbara had ruthlessly hoarded for years was entirely stripped away under the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of federal justice. As the tactical team guided Bradley toward the gangway leading down to the federal transport boat, Nathaniel stepped smoothly out from the crowd. He signaled the lead agent requesting a brief moment with the disgraced founder before he was officially removed from the premises. The agent nodded, holding Bradley firmly in place at the top of the ramp. Bradley looked up at the towering billionaire investor, his eyes wide with a desperate mixture of fear and confusion. "Oh, I almost forgot to mention one minor administrative detail," Nathaniel said, his deep voice carrying a tone of casual, predatory amusement. Bradley swallowed hard, his chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. "What do you want?" Bradley croaked, completely broken. "I wanted to clarify exactly how I spent my money at the charity gala," Nathaniel explained, adjusting his pristine jacket. "I did not just hand over $5 million to make a public statement. My financial analysts tracked the exact holding companies you used to harbor your stolen equity. I used that $5 million to quietly buy up all your hidden offshore debt through a proxy investment firm. Do you understand what that means, Bradley? I now legally own 51% of your company's voting rights. You no longer have a board of directors to manipulate. I control the entire infrastructure. And I will be thoroughly liquidating your entire life's work first thing on Monday morning." Bradley completely broke down. The once arrogant tech founder collapsed forward, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably as the absolute inescapable reality of his completely ruined existence finally crushed his broken spirit. He looked past Nathaniel and stared directly at me, tears streaming down his face as he begged and pleaded for mercy. "Stella, please help me," he cried out, his voice cracking with utter desperation. "You have to stop them right now. Please, Stella, we are married. We are a family. You cannot just let them do this to me." I walked slowly across the polished teak deck, stopping right at the very edge of the gangway to look down at the pathetic man kneeling in cold federal handcuffs. I looked at him with complete, absolute icy detachment. "I was auctioned off, remember," I said quietly. "My contract with you expired." 1 month passed since the catastrophic collapse of the yacht Gala, and the entire landscape of Silicon Valley had fundamentally shifted. The exact same tabloid magazines and tech blogs that had eagerly branded me a manipulative gold digger just weeks earlier were now singing an entirely different tune. I had officially been crowned the forensic queen of Silicon Valley. Major financial news networks spent hours analyzing how I had successfully infiltrated and dismantled one of the most fraudulent tech startups in California history, right under the nose of the mainstream media. My firm experienced an unprecedented surge in high-profile clients. Corporations and federal agencies were practically begging to put us on retainer, desperate to ensure their own ledgers were clean before I decided to audit them myself. I walked through the glass doors of my underground command center, holding a steaming cup of coffee, feeling an absolute, unshakable sense of peace. The storm I had unleashed was still raging, but I was no longer standing in the rain. I was controlling the lightning. The devastating reality for my former in-laws was unfolding exactly as I had predicted. The Department of Justice moved with terrifying efficiency. Because Bradley had used a complex web of offshore shell companies to launder the stolen venture capital, the federal prosecutors invoked the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The powerful RICO laws allowed the government to immediately seize every single asset tied to the illicit funds. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar mansion Barbara had paraded around in was confiscated and padlocked by federal agents in less than 48 hours.
Every luxury vehicle, every piece of expensive diamond jewelry, and every offshore bank account was frozen and permanently stripped away. Cassidy lost her pristine suburban home the exact same week Malik finalized their divorce and secured full custody of their child. Without Malik providing his substantial corporate salary, and without Bradley funding their lavish lifestyle with stolen money, Barbara and Cassidy were completely, utterly broke. The untouchable socialites of Silicon Valley were violently dragged down to earth. I received a detailed report from my lead investigator confirming they had been forced to move into a tiny rundown motel on the outskirts of Oakland, entirely abandoned by the wealthy friends who had eagerly attended their fraudulent parties just 1 month ago. They were finally experiencing the exact financial terror they had subjected me to for years. I attended Bradley's official federal bail hearing on a gloomy, overcast Tuesday morning. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, sitting quietly in the very back row of the heavily guarded federal courthouse. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and the disgraced former tech visionary was escorted into the room. Bradley looked absolutely hollow. He was stripped of his custom-tailored tuxedo and forced to wear a standard bright orange federal prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished floor with every dragging step. He looked around the courtroom with wide, panicked eyes, visibly searching for a friendly face or a high-priced defense attorney ready to save him. But the high-priced lawyers required massive retainers, and his assets were completely frozen. He was represented by a completely exhausted public defender who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. The federal judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for white-collar crime, struck his gavel and brought the hearing to order. The federal prosecutor laid out the massive flight risk Bradley posed. He pointed directly to the $50 million Bradley had systematically wired to the Cayman Islands and the private emergency speedboat he had attempted to use to flee the scene of the crime. The judge did not even hesitate. Considering the overwhelming evidence of financial fraud, the offshore ties, and the documented attempt to evade federal agents' bail is unequivocally denied. The judge announced, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. The defendant is remanded to federal custody pending trial. Bradley slumped forward onto the defense table, burying his face in his chained hands as he sobbed loudly. He was completely defeated. His brilliant empire was nothing more than a pile of federal evidence. I stood up from the wooden bench, adjusted my suit jacket, and walked out of the courtroom before the bailiffs even hauled him away. I stepped out through the heavy glass doors of the federal building and into the cold, pouring rain. My driver had already pulled my sleek black sport utility vehicle up to the curb. Just as I reached for the door handle, a desperate, soaking wet figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. It was Cassidy. She looked absolutely wretched. Her designer clothes were replaced by a cheap, damp coat, and her hair hung in messy, wet strands around her pale face. She lunged forward, pressing her hands against the wet glass of my car door. "Stella, please wait!" she cried out, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "You have to help us. Mom is sick, and we cannot afford the motel rent for another week. We have absolutely nothing left. You have millions now. Just give me a loan from your firm. I swear I will pay you back. I beg of you, please do not leave us here like this." I stood in the doorway of the car looking at the woman who had happily agreed to frame her innocent husband and send him to federal prison just to keep her luxury handbags. She had stood on that front lawn and thrown my clothes into the dirt, calling me a common gold digger. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I slid into the plush leather seat, looked directly into her terrified, desperate eyes, and simply pressed the button to roll up the dark-tinted window, leaving her standing entirely alone in the freezing rain. She screamed my name one final time as my driver pulled away from the curb. The rain from the previous afternoon had completely cleared, leaving the San Francisco skyline gleaming under a crisp, bright morning sun. I sat at a secluded corner table inside one of the most exclusive high-end restaurants in the financial district. The quiet hum of wealthy patrons
and the clinking of crystal glasses provided the perfect backdrop for the meeting I had meticulously planned. I sipped my sparkling water and watched the entrance. Right on time, Malik walked through the heavy glass doors. He looked entirely different from the stressed, suffocated man who used to pace the corporate hallways of my husband's fraudulent empire. The heavy burden of surviving my toxic in-laws was completely gone from his shoulders. He wore a sharp, impeccably tailored navy suit, and his posture radiated a calm, undeniable confidence. He spotted me and walked over, a warm, genuine smile breaking across his face. "It is incredibly good to see you, Stella," Malik said, pulling out the chair across from me. He signaled the waiter for a black coffee and settled into his seat. "You look like a woman who just conquered the entire city." "I think we both conquered our respective battles," I replied smoothly. "How are the legal proceedings treating you?" "I saw the headlines about the asset seizures yesterday." Malik let out a long, relieved breath. "It is officially over. The judge finalized the divorce decrees this morning." Cassidy tried to contest the custody arrangements, but the federal indictment against her brother and the ongoing racketeering investigation completely destroyed her credibility in family court. The judge granted me full primary physical custody of my daughter. Cassidy only gets supervised visitation twice a month, assuming she can afford the bus fare to the facility. I nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction for him. Malik had been treated like a disposable accessory for years, enduring their blatant microaggressions and constant disrespect solely to keep his family together. Now he was entirely free, walking away with the only thing that truly mattered: his child. "I am genuinely happy for you, Malik," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You protected your daughter from growing up in that toxic, narcissistic environment. You did the absolute right thing. But now that your personal legal battles are officially resolved, we need to discuss your professional future." Malik raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his coffee. "Silicon Valley is a small town, Stella. The federal immunity agreement keeps me out of prison, but being the former director of compliance for the biggest corporate fraud scandal of the decade makes me highly radioactive. Most mainstream tech companies will not even look at my resume right now. They are terrified of the optics." "I know they are," I countered smoothly. "That is because mainstream tech companies are run by cowards who care more about public relations than actual integrity. I do not run a tech company. I run a forensic auditing firm, and I require something entirely different." I reached into my designer leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, sleek, leather-bound folder. I slid it deliberately across the pristine white tablecloth until it rested directly in front of him. "I need a chief compliance officer," I stated, maintaining absolute eye contact. "I need someone who knows exactly how corporate criminals hide their money. I need an expert who understands the complex architecture of offshore shell companies, because he was forced to dismantle one from the inside. But most importantly, I need a partner possessing an unbreakable moral compass. I need you, Malik." Malik stared at the leather-bound folder, visibly stunned. He slowly opened the cover and read the first page of the contract. His eyes widened as he processed the compensation figures. "Stella," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "This base salary is triple what Bradley ever paid me. This includes a full equity stake in your firm." "You are worth exactly what that contract states, and not a single penny less," I told him firmly. "Bradley and his mother paid you a fraction of your actual value because they wanted to keep you dependent on their elite status. They used you to check a diversity box, and then plotted to throw you in a federal penitentiary to save their own stolen wealth. I do not want a scapegoat, I want a titan." Malik looked up from the contract. The raw, profound emotion reflecting in his eyes was unmistakable. For years, he had been systematically minimized, constantly reminded by Cassidy and Barbara that he was merely a fortunate employee who had married into their golden family. Now, the most feared forensic auditor in California was offering him a seat at the absolute top of the financial food chain, validating his immense talent and unwavering integrity. Without another word of hesitation, Malik reached inside his jacket, pulled out his fountain pen, and signed his name on the dotted line. He closed the folder and pushed it back across the table, a bright, triumphant smile taking over his face.
The waiter arrived at that exact moment carrying 2 crystal flutes. I raised my glass of sparkling water and Malik raised his coffee cup. "I am not going to toast to revenge," I said quietly, looking at my new business partner. "Revenge implies we are still letting them dictate our actions. We are not." To surviving the fire, Malik added his voice ringing with pure clarity. "And to taking back our worth." We clinked our glasses together, sealing the new alliance. The beautiful moment felt like the ultimate victory, the absolutely perfect conclusion to a very long, exhausting war. But our quiet celebration was suddenly interrupted by a commanding presence approaching our table. Nathaniel smoothly joined us at the table, bringing a bottle of $10,000 champagne. He looked sharp and intensely focused. "I have a new business proposition for you, Stella, one that will solidify your status at the top of the financial food chain." Nathaniel poured the pale golden liquid into 3 crystal flutes, bubbles rising to the surface. He set the bottle into the silver ice bucket and looked across the table with a calculated intensity. The proposition he mentioned earlier hung in the air, thick with potential. He wanted a permanent alliance between his massive private equity conglomerate and my rapidly expanding forensic auditing firm. His strategy was brilliantly ruthless. He would continue to identify bloated, overvalued technology startups and acquire them through hostile takeovers. My team and I would be deployed immediately as the designated cleaners. We would strip the acquired companies down to their foundation, auditing every ledger, exposing any lingering corruption, and completely restructuring their financial architecture. We would essentially become the apex predators of the Silicon Valley ecosystem. The numbers printed there were staggering, guaranteeing my firm an unprecedented level of sustained growth and absolute industry dominance. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, swirling the champagne in his glass. His dark eyes softened slightly, shifting away from the cold calculation of a business mogul to something much more personal. He told me that in all his years navigating the cutthroat world of venture capital, he had never met a woman with my specific combination of intellect, resilience, and unyielding fortitude. His voice dropped to a lower, more intimate register as he suggested that our partnership did not necessarily have to be confined strictly to boardrooms and financial audits. He hinted smoothly that a personal relationship between us would be an unstoppable force. He was offering me the ultimate fairy tale ending, the handsome billionaire swooping in to elevate the wronged woman to the highest echelon of high society. But I did not want a fairy tale. I looked at the man who had catalyzed my liberation, and I offered him a warm smile. I slowly pushed my champagne flute forward, shaking my head. I told Nathaniel I was incredibly flattered, but my answer to anything beyond a professional contract was a definitive no. I explained that I had just spent 5 exhausting years building a man up from absolutely nothing, sacrificing my own peace to fuel his fragile ego, only to be tossed onto a public auction block the moment he tasted real power. I had just fought a brutal war to buy back my own freedom, and I had zero intention of handing the keys to my life over to another powerful man, no matter how respectful or wealthy he might be. I did not need a billionaire savior, and I certainly did not want to become a trophy wife standing in the shadow of a corporate titan. I wanted to stand entirely on my own 2 feet. Nathaniel did not look offended by the rejection. Instead, a look of profound, genuine respect washed over his features. He raised his glass to me, acknowledging my fiercely guarded autonomy. He agreed without a single argument, accepting the firm boundary I had just drawn. We shook hands right there over the pristine white tablecloth, cementing a strictly platonic, immensely powerful business partnership built on mutual admiration and professional terror. 7 months passed since that quiet celebration at the restaurant, bringing an absolute crushing finality to the chaos my former husband had unleashed. The California morning was cold and gray when I walked through the heavy metal detectors of the federal courthouse downtown. I bypassed the crowded media pens and quietly slipped into the heavy wooden double doors of Courtroom 4. The massive room was packed with defrauded investors, corporate lawyers, and federal agents. I took a seat in the very back row, blending into the shadows of the gallery. A heavy side door opened and 2 armed United States Marshals escorted the defendant into the room. Bradley looked completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, slick technology visionary who had strutted across a gala stage in a custom-tailored tuxedo was entirely gone. He had aged 10 years in the span of 7 months. His face was hollow and haggard, his skin carrying the sickly pale pallor of a man who had not seen genuine sunlight in weeks. He wore a baggy, standard-issue bright orange federal prison jumpsuit. His wrists were bound by heavy steel chains that rattled loudly in the silent courtroom as he shuffled toward the defense table. He looked small, broken, and utterly pathetic. The federal judge, a stern woman with decades of experience dismantling white-collar criminals, stared down at him from the elevated bench. She did not mince her words during the sentencing phase. She systematically tore apart his carefully constructed illusion of genius, reading aloud the precise details of his $50 million embezzlement scheme. She highlighted his immense greed, his breathtaking arrogance, and the callous way he had attempted to frame an innocent employee to save his own skin. The entire room held its breath as she raised her wooden gavel. The judge declared that wire fraud of this magnitude required a severe, unyielding consequence. She sentenced Bradley to exactly 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that sealed his fate forever. The sound seemed to jolt Bradley out of his frozen stupor. Knowing his life as a free man was officially over, he turned slowly around to face the crowded gallery behind him. His bloodshot, terrified eyes desperately scanned the rows of hostile faces, searching blindly for a shred of pity or forgiveness from the people he had robbed. His frantic gaze swept over the investors, past the federal agents, until his eyes finally locked onto the very back row. He saw me sitting there in the shadows. I did not smile. I did not glare. My expression remained a perfectly cold, unreadable mask. I simply sat there in absolute silence, watching the man who had tried to sell me for $22 finally face the devastating, inescapable consequence of his own colossal hubris. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut behind me for the final time. The cold California wind whipped through my dark hair as I descended the granite steps, but I did not pull my tailored winter coat tighter. I let the sharp, biting breeze wash over me, carrying away the last lingering remnants of the man who had tried to sell my dignity to the highest bidder. Bradley was gone, locked away in a concrete cell for the next 12 years, and I was stepping into a world I had built entirely on my own terms. My driver waited at the curb, holding open the back door to my SUV. I slid into the quiet leather interior and gave him a single destination. We were heading home, but not to a domestic sanctuary. We were driving straight to the epicenter of my new empire. The iron gates of the Silicon Valley estate swung open smoothly as my vehicle approached. Just 7 months ago, this was the exact driveway where my former mother-in-law and sister-in-law had gleefully thrown my folded sweaters into the dirt. Now the sprawling property was completely unrecognizable. I had gutted the mansion down to its studs. Barbara had decorated the house with gaudy gold trim, heavy velvet drapes, and absurd crystal chandeliers meant to project an illusion of old money. I stripped all of that toxic vanity away. In its place stood a sleek, modern fortress of tempered glass, reinforced steel, and matte black finishes. This estate was no longer a hollow monument to a fraudulent tech chief executive officer. It was the highly secure primary headquarters of the most feared forensic auditing firm on the West Coast. I walked through the reinforced front double doors and was immediately greeted by the intense, focused hum of high-stakes corporate warfare. The expansive main living room, where Bradley used to host his lavish, deceitful investor parties, had been meticulously transformed into a massive open-floor command center. Dual-monitor workstations lined the perimeter, and dozens of elite financial analysts moved with purposeful urgency. At the center of the room, standing confidently in front of a massive, transparent digital whiteboard, was Malik. He wore a tailored navy suit, completely in his element as my chief compliance officer. He was actively directing a team of junior auditors, using a laser pointer to trace complex routing anomalies in a newly acquired corporate ledger. When I walked past the analytic pit, the frantic chatter in the room quieted down.
The senior analysts offered me subtle nods of profound respect, heavily tinged with a healthy dose of professional fear. They knew exactly what I was capable of executing. Malik caught my eye across the room and offered a warm, triumphant smile. We did not need to exchange a single word. He was a brilliant African-American man who had been treated like a disposable accessory by my former in-laws, and now he was commanding a multi-million-dollar division, holding the financial fate of corrupt corporate executives right in the palms of his hands. I returned his smile and continued down the glass hallway, pushing open the heavy door to my private corner office. This space used to be Bradley's master suite, where he had plotted his offshore embezzlement schemes. Now it was a pristine, minimalist sanctuary of absolute control. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the rolling hills, but my attention was drawn to a single item hanging prominently on the dark accent wall behind my mahogany desk. It was not a prestigious university diploma or a flashy corporate award. It was a simple, minimalist black frame containing a certified bank check written out for exactly $22. I walked around my desk and traced the edge of the smooth glass frame with my fingertip. That tiny, insignificant sum of money was the exact price my husband had slapped on my head in front of 400 elite guests. He had handed me a microphone and demanded I play the role of the useless, boring accountant so he could feel like a powerful titan. He never realized that by publicly defining my professional worth at $22 an hour, he had fully funded his own spectacular execution. That humiliating night at the charity gala was not the end of my story. It was the exact moment I decided to stop shrinking myself to fit inside his fragile ego and instead burn his entire fraudulent reality to ashes. I had taken everything from him, his wealth, his freedom, and his home, and built a legitimate powerhouse from the wreckage. A soft knock at my office door broke my intense concentration. My senior executive assistant, David, stepped into the room holding a thick, securely encrypted digital tablet. He looked completely professional, but there was a distinct, urgent tightness in his jaw. "I apologize for the interruption," Stella, David said, walking briskly toward my desk. "But we just received a highly classified data packet from Nathaniel's private equity group. He said it requires your immediate, undivided attention." I pulled my gaze away from the framed $22 check and sat down in my leather chair. "What is the target?" I asked, my voice dropping into a sharp clinical register as I prepared to shift gears. David placed the glowing tablet directly in front of me and tapped the screen to unlock the encrypted file. "It is a massive Wall Street investment bank," David revealed, leaning forward slightly. "Nathaniel's elite internal spies are showing severe catastrophic signs of localized embezzlement, masking a massive, unprecedented liquidity crisis. The board of directors is completely blind, and the chief executive officer is desperately trying to route billions through shadow accounts before the federal regulators notice the missing capital." I stared at the staggering numbers illuminating the bright tablet screen. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. The dangerous game continues, and I never lose. I accepted the encrypted tablet from David, offering my assistant a quiet nod of dismissal. As the heavy glass door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the expansive corner office, I did not immediately look at the new financial data. Instead, I carried the glowing device across the polished hardwood floor and pushed open the heavy glass doors leading out to my private balcony. The sharp wind sweeping off the San Francisco Bay caught my hair. I stepped up to the reinforced glass railing and looked out over the sprawling, glittering skyline. Down below, millions of people were rushing through their daily lives, completely unaware of the invisible financial wars being waged high above their heads. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing California air fill my lungs. It was a stark reminder that I was actually here, standing at the absolute pinnacle of the corporate food chain. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, allowing myself to reflect on the unbelievable journey that brought me to this exact balcony. Just 7 months ago, I was sitting in a cramped, windowless basement office in our old suburban house, running 3 computer monitors while desperately trying to balance the failing ledgers of my husband's hollow startup. I had been the ultimate silent, submissive wife. I had actively muted my brilliance, swallowed my ambition, and continuously folded myself into smaller boxes just so Bradley could feel like a giant.
I tolerated his passive-aggressive insults, his endless financial demands, and his suffocating narcissism because I genuinely believed that marriage required unwavering sacrifice. I gave him everything I had, only to end up standing under a blinding spotlight in a crowded ballroom, listening to the man I loved auction me off to a room full of venture capitalists for $22 an hour. That night at the charity gala was supposed to be the ultimate destruction of my dignity. Bradley had designed that public humiliation to break my spirit completely, to ensure I would quietly disappear into the shadows while he rang the bell at the stock exchange and stepped into his new life as a tech billionaire. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. He did not break me on that stage. He simply shattered the heavy, suffocating illusion I had been living under, setting me completely free to unleash the ruthless, highly capable architect of his corporate execution. The mainstream media and the elite socialites of Silicon Valley still whispered about the mysterious sequence of events that led to my ultimate victory. Many of them still quietly assumed that Nathaniel had swooped in to save me, that the billionaire investor had used his massive fortune to rescue a helpless accountant from a toxic marriage. But standing here looking out over the empire I had built, I knew the absolute truth. My power never came from Nathaniel's $5 million check. His money was nothing more than a temporary key used to unlock a door. The actual weapon that dismantled my husband's corrupt syndicate was my own relentless competence. It was the thousands of grueling hours I had spent mastering the intricate architecture of forensic auditing. It was my unique ability to look at a wall of fabricated financial data and instantly spot the rotting, deceptive core hiding underneath. I had not relied on a wealthy savior to fight my battles. I weaponized my intellect, forged an unbreakable alliance with Malik based on mutual respect, and orchestrated a spectacular, devastating takedown entirely on my own terms. My unwavering self-respect was the true foundation of my newly reclaimed freedom. I opened my eyes, the vibrant city lights reflecting in my gaze. I turned away from the sweeping panoramic view and stepped back inside the quiet warmth of my executive office. As the sliding glass balcony doors sealed shut, the soft sound of the television mounted on the far wall caught my attention. A major financial news network was broadcasting its evening report. The breaking news ticker, scrolling rapidly across the bottom of the screen, caught my eye, and I paused in the center of the room to watch. A high-definition photograph of Bradley flashed onto the screen. He was no longer wearing the custom-tailored tuxedo he favored during his days as a tech visionary. He was dressed in a drab, oversized orange federal prison jumpsuit, his hands shackled at his waist. The news anchor spoke with a serious clinical tone, detailing his official transfer from a temporary holding center to a high-security federal penitentiary located in the remote desert. The broadcast highlighted the absolute finality of his 12-year sentence, noting the remaining assets of his fraudulent offshore shell companies had been entirely liquidated and redistributed to the defrauded investors. I watched the brief video clip of my former husband shuffling onto a heavily armored federal transport bus, his head bowed in total inescapable defeat. I did not feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy, nor did I feel a lingering pang of sorrow. I felt nothing but a truly profound, beautifully quiet sense of closure. The highly toxic chapter of my life was permanently sealed. I walked over to the sleek coffee station near my mahogany desk and poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee. The rich aroma filled the quiet office. I took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle into my chest. A genuine, deeply peaceful smile slowly spread across my face. I walked around to my large leather chair and sat down. I placed my coffee mug on a coaster and picked up the encrypted digital tablet my assistant delivered. I tapped my complex security passcode into the screen, unlocking the highly classified file detailing the massive internal embezzlement at the Wall Street Investment Bank. My eyes scanned the first row of staggering manipulated financial data. The screen slowly fades to black on the image of a woman who truly knows exactly what she is worth.
Oh thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every